What transforms a pure heart into one consumed by darkness? Behind the iconic horns and emerald flames lies one of Disney's most psychologically complex characters. Maleficent wasn't born evil, she was made. Tonight we dive deep into the twisted psychology of betrayal, trauma, and how a single moment can shatter everything we believe about justice and love. What you discover might forever change how you see this legendary villain. In the mystical moors, where magic flows like rivers and every creature lives in harmony, there once existed a being of pure light, Maleficent. This wasn't the horned sorceress we know, but a young fairy with wings that shimmered like starlight, protector of all magical beings. Her world operated on principles of trust, natural balance, and unconditional protection of the innocent. From a psychological standpoint, Maleficent represented what psychologists call secure attachment. She had formed healthy bonds with her environment and community. Her identity was built on being a guardian, a role that provided her with purpose, self-worth, and meaning. This is crucial because our core identity, especially when formed in childhood and adolescence, becomes the foundation of who we are. The moors were her sanctuary, and she ruled not through fear or dominance, but through love and mutual respect. Every creature, from the smallest flower fairy to the massive tree spirits, looked to her for guidance. This created what we call a positive feedback loop. In psychology, her protective actions reinforced her sense of purpose, which motivated more protective behavior. But psychologists know that the strongest identities, when shattered, often create the most devastating transformations. The very qualities that made Maleficent a perfect protector, her absolute trust, her fierce loyalty, her willingness to sacrifice everything for love, would soon become the tools of her own destruction. In those peaceful days, she befriended a human boy named Stefan. Their innocent friendship blossomed into young love, bridging two worlds that had long been separated by fear and misunderstanding. She gave him her heart completely, showing him the magic of her realm, trusting him with her deepest secrets. But love, when it becomes the center of our identity, can also become our greatest vulnerability. The young Maleficent had no concept of betrayal. In her world, love was pure, protection was absolute, and trust was never questioned. She existed in what psychologists call cognitive innocence, unable to even conceive that someone she loved could harm her. But humanity operates by different rules, and Stefan carried within him the seeds of ambition that would soon bloom into something monstrous. Something that would teach Maleficent that sometimes the greatest evil comes from those we trust the most. Years passed, and Stefan returned, but not as the innocent boy Maleficent once knew. Now, he was a man consumed by ambition, his eyes reflecting the cold hunger for power that had replaced the warmth she remembered. The dying king had declared that whoever could destroy Maleficent would inherit the throne, and Stefan saw his opportunity. When he approached her with false tenderness, Maleficent's heart soared. Love had clouded her judgment completely, a phenomenon psychologists call confirmation bias, where we interpret information to confirm what we desperately want to believe. Every gentle word, every familiar gesture, she read as proof that their love had survived time and distance. She trusted him enough to let her guard down completely, to become vulnerable in his presence. In psychological terms, she was experiencing what we call trauma bonding, the deep emotional connection formed through shared intimate experiences, which made his betrayal exponentially more devastating. The moment Stefan drugged her and severed her wings while she lay helpless represents one of the most profound psychological traumas possible. Betrayal by a trusted loved one combined with physical violation. But this wasn't just physical assault, it was identity annihilation. Her wings weren't merely body parts. They were symbols of her freedom, her power, her very essence as a fairy. Neurologically, trauma of this magnitude literally rewires the brain. The amygdala, our fear center, becomes hyperactive, while the prefrontal cortex responsible for rational thinking becomes suppressed. Maleficent's brain was no longer processing the world through love and trust, but through threat detection and survival. When she awakened, wingless and broken, something fundamental shifted in her psyche. Psychologists call this post-traumatic growth, but in reverse. Instead of emerging stronger and wiser, Maleficent experienced what we might term post-traumatic deterioration. Her core beliefs about love, trust, and justice shattered like glass. The crow who witnessed her anguish became the devil, transformed into human form to serve her. Even in her pain, she was creating new bonds, but these were relationships built on power and utility, not love and trust. Her psychological framework was already adapting, replacing vulnerability with control. She erected thorns around the moors, not just physical barriers, but emotional ones. In psychology, we call this defensive detachment. Having been wounded so deeply by intimacy, she began to structure her world to prevent such vulnerability from ever happening again. But the most insidious change was happening in her moral reasoning. The woman who once protected through love now began to contemplate protection through fear. And it was here that Tudo Kamakua roared. In the years following her betrayal, Maleficent's transformation accelerated with mathematical precision. She didn't become evil overnight, she evolved into it, step by carefully calculated step. Psychologists call this process moral disengagement, where individuals gradually adjust their ethical standards to justify increasingly harmful actions. Her appearance began to change, reflecting her internal state. The soft features hardened into sharp angles, her clothing darkened from earthy tones to midnight black. But these weren't random changes, they were psychological armor. The horns that grew from her head weren't just intimidating. They were crowns of pain, physical manifestations of her psychological thorns. She began to view the world through what cognitive scientists call hostile attribution bias, the tendency to interpret ambiguous situations as threatening or malicious. Where she once saw potential for good in humans, she now saw only duplicity and greed. Stefan's betrayal became her template for understanding all human behavior. Her interactions with her subjects in the moors revealed this shift. Where she once ruled through inspiration, she now governed through intimidation. The creatures still obeyed her, but out of fear rather than love. She was creating what psychologists term a terror management system, using fear of consequences to maintain order. Most disturbing was how she began to rationalize her transformation. In her mind, she wasn't becoming evil. She was becoming realistic. She told herself that her previous kindness had been naivety, that her trust had been foolishness. This cognitive restructuring is a classic defense mechanism called rationalization, where we create logical-sounding reasons for our emotional reactions. When news reached her of Stefan's coronation and his newborn daughter, Aurora, something crystallized in Maleficent's mind. This wasn't just an opportunity for revenge. It was, in her twisted logic, a chance to create perfect justice. Stefan had stolen her childhood innocence. She would steal his daughter's future. The curse she crafted was psychologically brilliant in its cruelty. Asleep like death, before Aurora's 16th birthday, triggered by a spinning wheel's touch. It wasn't just punishment, it was poetry. The very domestic tool that symbolized women's traditional roles would be the instrument of Stefan's lineage's end. But notice the loophole she included. True love's kiss could break the spell. Even in her darkness, some part of her still believed in love's power, or perhaps she was testing whether it truly existed. After all, if Stefan could betray true love, then perhaps true love was just another illusion. As she watched the three good fairies take Aurora away, Maleficent smiled with satisfaction. Her revenge was now in motion, a slow-burning psychological torture that would consume Stefan just as his betrayal had consumed her. But o verdadero monstro ainda estava adormecido. because Maleficent hadn't yet realized that in cursing Aurora, she had also cursed herself to 16 years of watching innocence from the shadows. For 16 years, Maleficent watched Aurora grow from the shadows, telling herself she was merely ensuring her curse would come to pass. But psychology rarely follows our conscious intentions. What began as surveillance slowly transformed into something far more complex and ultimately more dangerous to her carefully constructed walls of hatred. Aurora, raised by the bumbling good fairies, grew into everything Maleficent had once been: trusting, kind, and filled with natural magic. Watching her became a form of psychological self-torture. Every day, Maleficent saw her former self reflected in this innocent girl, creating what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs. The rational part of her mind insisted Aurora was the enemy, Stefan's daughter who deserved punishment. But her emotional brain began forming what researchers call parasocial attachment, a one-sided emotional connection that felt increasingly real. She found herself protecting Aurora from dangers, ensuring the fairies fed her properly, even sending gentle breezes to dry her tears. This created an impossible psychological trap. To maintain her identity as a vengeful sorceress, she needed to hate Aurora. But to protect this innocent child she'd grown to love, she needed to abandon that very identity. The internal conflict was tearing her psyche apart. When Aurora finally encountered her fairy godmother face to face, the girl's instant trust and affection shattered something fundamental in Maleficent's defense system. Here was a human offering her pure, unconditional love, the very thing Stefan had perverted and destroyed. It forced her to confront an unbearable truth. Not all humans were like Stefan. The psychological term for what happened next is emotional flooding, when suppressed feelings overwhelm our rational defenses. 16 years of buried maternal instincts, love, and regret crashed over her like a tsunami. She tried desperately to revoke the curse, but magic bound by hatred cannot be undone by love, at least not directly. As Aurora's 16th birthday approached, Maleficent faced the point of no return. She could either let the curse claim Aurora and preserve her identity as a vengeful fairy, or she could find a way to save the girl and face the psychological death of everything she'd become. In a moment that revealed the depths of her transformation, she chose love over revenge. But saving Aurora meant confronting Stefan directly, the source of all her trauma. When she appeared at the castle, horns gleaming and darkness swirling around her, she wasn't just facing her enemy. She was facing the moment that had broken her, armed now with 16 years of pain and power. The final battle wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. Stefan, driven mad by guilt and paranoia, had become as twisted as she was, but in the opposite direction. Where trauma had made her withdraw from love, it had made him cling to control with deadly desperation. But here, as the terrifying question that haunted every witness to their confrontation. When two people destroy each other so completely, who decides which one becomes the villain and which one becomes the victim? To understand Maleficent's transformation, we must examine the neuroscience of trauma and revenge. When Stefan severed her wings, he didn't just cause physical damage. He triggered what researchers call complex PTSD, a condition that fundamentally alters brain structure and function. Studies using neuroimaging have shown that severe betrayal trauma creates measurable changes in the brain. The amygdala, our alarm system, becomes hyperactive and oversized. The hippocampus, responsible for memory processing, actually shrinks. Most critically, the prefrontal cortex, our center for empathy and moral reasoning, shows decreased activity. Maleficent's brain had literally been rewired for survival, not connection. But here is where her story becomes truly fascinating from a scientific perspective. Her transformation wasn't random emotional breakdown. It was systematic adaptation. Evolutionary psychologists argue that revenge serves an important function. It deters future betrayals and establishes reputation. In Maleficent's world, becoming feared wasn't pathological. It was strategically brilliant. Research by Dr. Kevin McCullough on adaptive revenge shows that individuals who successfully retaliate against betrayal often experience improved social standing and reduced likelihood of future victimization. Maleficent's reign of terror over the human kingdom served this exact function. No one dared cross the fairy realms again. Her curse on Aurora demonstrates what psychologists call displaced aggression. When we can't directly harm the source of our pain, we target something they value. This isn't random cruelty. It's calculated psychological warfare. By threatening Stefan's daughter, she ensured he would experience the same helpless terror she had felt. The 16-year delay wasn't just dramatic flair. It was psychological torture refined to an art form. Every day, Stefan would wake knowing his daughter was in danger, unable to prevent it, watching time slip away. This prolonged anticipatory anxiety creates the same neurological damage as the trauma itself. But the most chilling aspect is how logically sound her actions were within her altered moral framework. If we accept her premise that humans are fundamentally selfish and cruel, then every action she took was not only justified, but necessary. She wasn't being evil. She was being rational within a worldview shaped by trauma. Comparative analysis with other historical figures who experienced similar betrayals shows remarkably similar patterns. Withdrawal from social bonds, construction of protective barriers, systematic retaliation against perceived threats, and moral rationalization of increasingly extreme actions. Maleficent wasn't unique, she was textbook. Studies of maternal attachment show that her growing love for Aurora was inconsistent with her revenge. It was psychological completion. By saving Aurora, she was symbolically saving her younger self, the innocent fairy who had been destroyed. Her final confrontation with Stefan wasn't about defeating him. It was about reclaiming her stolen identity. The most disturbing realization? When we map Maleficent's psychological journey against established models of trauma recovery and moral development, we discover something unsettling. Now era lucora. Era calculo frio. Every choice, every transformation, every act of apparent evil was her psyche's attempt to heal itself through the only pathway her damaged brain could perceive: absolute control through absolute power. In the aftermath of her final confrontation with Stefan, Maleficent emerged transformed once again. But this time, the change was toward integration rather than fragmentation. Having reclaimed her capacity for love through Aurora, she didn't simply return to her original state. Instead, she embodied something far more complex, a being who had experienced the depths of both darkness and light. Psychologically, this represents what researchers call post-traumatic growth, the positive psychological change that can emerge from struggling with highly challenging circumstances. But Maleficent's growth was unique because it incorporated her dark period rather than rejecting it. She had learned that love without boundaries is vulnerability, but boundaries without love are prisons. A restoration of Aurora's kingdom and her role as Aurora as protector created a new social order, one where power was tempered by wisdom earned through suffering. The humans who had once lived in terror of her now lived under her protection, creating what political psychologists call a benevolent hegemony. Fear and love coexisted in her governance, making rebellion both unnecessary and unthinkable. But the most profound legacy was psychological. Maleficent had proven that evil isn't born, it's created through trauma, isolation, and the distortion of natural protective instincts. Her story became a cautionary tale about the responsibility we bear for how we treat others, especially those who trust us completely. Contemporary studies in restorative justice show that Maleficent's approach, confronting the source of trauma while protecting future victims, is more effective than traditional punishment models. She didn't just defeat Stefan. She broke the cycle of violence that his ambition had initiated. Her relationship with Aurora also represents a form of corrective attachment, a psychological healing process where new, healthy relationships help repair damage from previous traumatic bonds. Through Aurora, Maleficent was able to experience trust and love without vulnerability, proving that healing is possible even after profound betrayal. From a sociological perspective, her story challenges our binary thinking about good and evil. Traditional narratives require clear heroes and villains, but Maleficent's journey reveals that these categories are fluid, contextual, and often more about perspective than absolute moral truth. The kingdom she ultimately protected was built on acknowledgement of complexity. Human nature wasn't purely good or evil, but capable of both depending on circumstances and choices. This created a more stable society than Stephen's fear-based rule or the fairies' naive optimism. Perhaps most importantly, Maleficent's transformation gave hope to others who had experienced similar traumas. Her story proved that our worst moments don't define us permanently, that integration and healing are possible even after we've done terrible things in our pain. But as we consider her final form, beautiful but scarred, loving but cautious, powerful but no longer destructive, we must ask ourselves, "Quem somos nós para julgar?" In a world that had failed to protect her innocence, perhaps her temporary darkness was not weakness but strength, not evil but evolution. And in the moors, where magic still flows like rivers, they say that sometimes you can still hear the whisper of wings in the wind, reminding us that maybe you don't be the last to discover that sometimes becoming the monster is the only way to save yourself from being consumed by monsters. Maleficent's journey reveals an uncomfortable truth. We are all capable of becoming what we most fear, given the right circumstances and enough pain. Her story isn't just about a fairy tale villain. It's about the psychology of trauma, the power of love to both destroy and heal, and the thin line between justice and revenge. In the end, perhaps the real magic was never in her powers, but in her choice to love again despite everything. What monsters might we become if tested as she was?